Nobody in the village of Greyvale talked about the stone hill after dark. Children were told not to go near it. Old people looked away when someone pointed at it. The hill was tall and dark, covered with thick moss and silence. Everyone knew the story, even if they never said it out loud. Something was inside that hill. Something had been inside it for a very long time. Mara did not believe in old stories. She was a researcher. She studied folklore and ancient history at a small university in the city. She had books about monsters, about ancient kings, about magic seals and forgotten kingdoms. But she kept them on her shelf the same way other people kept decorations. They were interesting. They were not real. Then her grandmother died, and everything changed. Her grandmother's name was Elda. She was a quiet woman who lived alone in a small stone house at the edge of Greyvale. She kept a garden. She made strong tea. She never talked much about the past. When Mara was a child, she used to visit during summer and listen to Elda hum old songs while she worked in the soil. They were not close in the way some grandmothers and granddaughters are close. But Mara had loved her in a steady, quiet way. After Elda passed, Mara was asked to clear out the house. There was no one else. She drove up alone on a gray Tuesday, with boxes and bin bags, and a heart that felt heavier than she expected. Most of what she found was ordinary: old dishes, folded blankets, a drawer full of buttons sorted by color. But at the back of the bedroom wardrobe, wrapped inside a wool scarf and tied with string, was a book. It was small and old. The cover was dark with age. The pages smelled like earth and candle wax. The writing inside was in a script that Mara recognized immediately. Ancient Highland notation, a language she had spent 3 years studying at university because almost no one else could read it. She sat down on the edge of her grandmother's bed and read for 2 hours without stopping. The book described a man, not a legend, not a creature from a fairy tale. A man, with a name, with a history, with people who had loved him, and enemies who had feared him. His name was Kale. He had been a king among his people for over 60 years, a ruler so respected that even the oldest and most powerful members of his council bowed when he entered a room. According to the book, that respect was exactly what destroyed him. The council, 7 elders who held power alongside the king, had been stealing. Not money, something more serious. They had been using the people's resources, their land, their labor, their trust, to make themselves stronger while the king's attention was elsewhere. When Kale discovered the truth and prepared to stand before his people and name what had been done, the council moved first. They performed an ancient ritual. They sealed him. The book described it carefully, in the dry, precise language of someone recording history rather than telling a story. Kale had been placed inside the Vithara stone, a natural rock formation at the top of the hill outside Greyvale, and bound there by old covenant magic. His body was preserved. His mind remained aware, but he could not move, could not speak, could not leave. The seal was designed to last forever. The council told the people that the king had gone mad, that he had become dangerous, that they had no choice. Nobody questioned them. Nobody had proof otherwise. Mara's family, the book explained, had served as keepers for generations. Neutral witnesses. They were tasked with maintaining the binding through a quiet ritual performed once every decade. Not strengthening it, simply monitoring it, making sure it held. They kept the record. They kept the secret. They were never supposed to interfere. Mara drove to the stone hill the next morning. She told herself she was going as a researcher. She wanted to see the Vithara stone in person, to photograph it, to stand where history had actually happened. She brought her camera, her voice recorder, and the book. She wore sensible boots. She was being professional. She also brought the book because, on the last page, there were instructions. Her grandmother had written them in the margin in a shaking, elderly hand. Instructions for a counter-ritual, a way to release the seal if it ever needed to be released. Elda had written a note beside them. For emergencies only. You will know if it is time. Mara had no intention of performing the ritual. She just wanted to look at the stone. The hill was harder to climb than it looked. By the time she reached the top, she was out of breath, and her boots were muddy, and the gray sky above her felt very low. The Vithara stone was larger than she had imagined, taller than a door, wider than a car, dark and smooth in the center, where centuries of hands had touched it. There was a crack running from top to bottom, thin as a thread, sealed over with something that looked like hardened resin. She put her hand on the stone. It was cold, much colder than the air around it, as if the cold were coming from somewhere very far inside. She opened the book. She told herself she was just testing her own translation, checking the accuracy of her work. She read the words aloud, quietly, in the old Highland dialect, the way she read all dead languages, carefully, as if handling something fragile. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the stone exhaled. There was no other word for it. A breath, deep and slow and ancient, moved through the rock and into the cold air around her. The crack widened by a finger's width. Then another. Mara stepped back. Her voice recorder was still running. She could hear herself on the playback later, very calm, saying, "Okay, okay." That happened. The crack spread slowly, the way ice breaks on a river in early spring, deliberate, inevitable, like something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment. Small pieces of stone fell away, the sealed resin along the crack turned to dust, and then, after about 10 minutes of this, a hand appeared. Mara did not run. She was not sure if this was bravery or simply shock. She stood very still and watched as a man pulled himself out of the stone with the slow, exhausted effort of someone climbing out of deep water. He was tall. He was dressed in clothing that did not belong to this century. His dark hair was tangled, and there was a long, pale scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone. His eyes, when they finally opened and found her face, were the color of a storm, gray and deep and very old. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he collapsed. Mara did what any reasonable person would do. She called for an ambulance. The ambulance came. The paramedics got out, looked around the hilltop, looked at her, asked if she was all right, and left. Because the man on the ground, for reasons she did not yet understand, had done something to prevent them from seeing him clearly. She did not fully understand how. She only knew that when they drove away, she was alone on the hilltop with an unconscious stranger who had just come out of a sealed rock. She stayed. She called her rental cottage. She called it a situation. She half carried, half dragged the man down the hill over the course of an hour, which was one of the most physically difficult things she had ever done. She got him into her car. She drove back to the cottage. She made tea because she did not know what else to do, and because her grandmother had always made tea when things were difficult, and right now the habit felt important. Cale woke up 2 days later. He did not say thank you. He sat up, looked around the small cottage room with its thin curtains and electric lamp, and stack of Mara's research books, and his expression was the expression of a man trying very hard to understand a world that had changed completely while he was not watching. Mara sat across from him at the small table and let him look. She had spent 2 days preparing for this conversation, making notes, writing questions. She had also spent considerable time talking herself out of calling the authorities, calling her colleagues, calling anyone. She had decided, for reasons she could not entirely explain, to wait. "How long?" he finally said. His voice was deep and rough from disuse, and his accent was unlike anything she had ever heard. Ancient and formal, but still clear. "About 300 years, she said. "Give or take." He was quiet for a long time after that. His name was exactly as the book said, Cale. He did not give her a family name, and she did not push. In those first careful days, they spoke in short exchanges, him asking questions about the world as it was now, her answering as simply and honestly as she could. And he was not warm, he was not friendly, but he was not cruel either. He listened when she spoke. He thought before he answered. He was, she slowly understood, a man who had spent centuries alone, with nothing but his own thoughts. And that kind of silence, either destroys a person or makes them very precise. On the 4th day, a woman arrived at the cottage door. Her name was Sable. She was older than she looked, with close-cropped silver hair and dark eyes that went sharp the moment they found Cale's face. She had been part of his inner circle before the sealing. She had survived by hiding, by moving from place to place, by keeping Cale's true story alive in whispers to the few people she trusted. When the seal broke, she had felt it. The way, she said, You feel a door open in a room you thought was empty. The reunion between Kale and Sable was not a happy scene. It was something quieter and more painful than happiness. Two people who had both been in their own kinds of prisons, finding each other after a very long time, neither of them quite sure how to begin. Sable told him what he had missed. It took most of the night. Mara sat in the corner and listened and took notes. Not because she thought she should, but because she could not stop herself. This was the history she had studied. This was the story she had believed was fiction. The news was not good. The pack, his people, the community he had built and led for decades, had scattered after his sealing. Without their king, without the truth about what the council had done, they had broken into smaller and smaller groups over the centuries. Some had assimilated into ordinary life. Some had simply disappeared. The political structure he had carefully built had been quietly dismantled and replaced with something that served the council's descendants instead. His name had been removed from every record. Not forgotten. Removed. There was a difference, and Kale understood it immediately. Forgotten things fade. Removed things are a choice. He did not rage. He did not raise his voice. He sat very still and listened to all of it. And when Sable finished, he looked at the book in Mara's hands. Her grandmother's record, the keeper's account, and said, "May I read that?" She handed it to him without hesitation. What followed was a strange and careful few weeks. Kale read the book. Mara translated the sections he struggled with. Together, the three of them, because Sable never left, they began to piece together the full picture of what had happened 300 years ago. Not from legend, from evidence. The book was more than a ritual guide. Elda and her ancestors had kept a detailed record of everything the council said and did around the time of the sealing. Private meetings, private agreements, names, dates, decisions. It was, Mara realized, a confession, written down by witnesses who had been too bound by their neutral role to speak up at the time, but who had written everything down so that one day someone could. That day, it turned out, was now. There was a man named Caius. He was the only surviving member of the original council, impossibly old, sustained by the same kind of ancient bloodline that had kept Kale alive in the stone. He lived under a different name now, in the city, running a quiet organization that held enormous influence over the supernatural community that existed in shadow, alongside the ordinary human world. When the seal broke, Caius felt it too. He began making preparations immediately. He contacted the scattered authorities of the supernatural world and told them that the sealed king had broken free. He said that Kale had been dangerous, that the sealing had been necessary, that he needed to be found and contained again before he caused harm. He did not know about the book. He did not know about Mara. He was operating on fear, and on a very old guilt that he had never once allowed himself to look at directly. Within days, there were people looking for Kale. The first group of them came to the cottage on a quiet afternoon. There were 4 of them, serious, professional, sent by Caius's network. Mara was outside when she heard the noise from within the house. She pushed open the door to find Kale dealing with the situation, with a calm efficiency that was frankly alarming to watch. He was not at full strength. 3 centuries in the stone had diminished him in ways that were still healing. But even diminished, he was not someone who could be easily taken by 4 people who had underestimated him. When it was over, he walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and drank it slowly. "We need to move," he said. "Yes," Mara agreed. "We do." They found Caius 2 weeks later. It was not difficult in the end. Sable had spent 3 centuries learning how to find people who did not want to be found, and the book contained details about Caius's habits and preferences that had not, it turned out, changed much over 300 years. The meeting took place in a large, cold building on the edge of the city. Caius had gathered people, representatives of the various councils and authorities that had formed in Kale's absence. He had planned to make the confrontation public, assuming it would confirm his story. He had assumed Kale would arrive violent, unstable, impossible to reason with. He had prepared arguments for why containment was the only answer. What he had not prepared for was Kale arriving quietly, sitting down across from him, and saying, "I am not here to take anything from you. I am here so that these people can hear what you did." Caius argued. He was good at arguing. He had had centuries of practice. He said that Kale had been dangerous, that an alpha of that power, unchecked, would have torn the world apart. that the council had acted for the good of everyone, including the humans who shared the world without knowing it. He believed this. That was the terrible thing. After 300 years, he had repeated his own justification so many times that it had become, to him, simply the truth. Kale did not argue back. He nodded to Mara. She opened the book and began to read. She read for a long time. The room was very quiet. The people Caius had gathered, some of them descendants of the original council families, some of them authorities who had simply inherited a system without knowing its origins, listened as 300 years of hidden record was spoken aloud for the first time. Every meeting, every decision, every name. Caius tried to interrupt twice. Nobody in the room looked at him when he did. When Mara finished, she closed the book. Her hands were steady. She was more surprised by that than anyone. The silence in the room lasted a long time. Caius, in the end, made one last attempt. There was a secondary binding, a failsafe he had embedded in the original seal, years after the sealing, designed to be triggered remotely if Kale ever escaped. He reached for it. Mara saw his hands move and did not know what he was doing, but Sable did, and Sable moved. The failsafe did not work. What neither Caius nor anyone else in the room had understood was what had happened on the hilltop when Mara spoke the counter-ritual. The original seal had used Kale's own essence, his wolf, in the language of his people, as the lock. When the seal broke, that essence had needed somewhere to anchor, something unbound, something that belonged to no faction, owed nothing to any bloodline, and stood in that moment entirely free. It had anchored to Mara. She did not understand fully what that meant. She was not sure she needed to. Not yet. What she knew was that when Caius reached for the failsafe and tried to pull Kale back into the stone, something in the air between them simply said no. Quiet and absolute, like a door closing gently but firmly in someone's face. Caius sat down. The fight went out of him in a way that looked almost like relief. A tribunal was arranged. Representatives from several neutral factions agreed to oversee it. The book was submitted as evidence. Caius was given the opportunity to present his account, which he did. Thoroughly, carefully, without flinching. He was, in his own way, a man who had been carrying something for a very long time, and the act of finally putting it down, even in these circumstances, seemed to release something in him. He was not harmed. He was held accountable. There is a difference. Kale did not reclaim his title. Not immediately, and perhaps not ever. That was a question he said he would need time to think about. 300 years of absence had changed the world, and he was honest enough to say that he was not the same person who had entered the stone. He was more patient now, slower to speak, more careful with his decisions, and more interested in listening than he had perhaps always been before. What he did reclaim was his name, his history, the truth of what had been done and why. The community that had scattered without knowing what had actually happened began, slowly, to hear the real account for the first time. For many of them, it answered questions they had held for generations, without knowing where they came from. Sable stayed. Others began to return. Mara packed her bags on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the tribunal. She had her notes, her photographs, her recordings. She had material for a research paper that would either make her career or get her laughed out of academic circles. And she had not yet decided which outcome she was more prepared for. She had the book, which Kale had asked her to keep. She had the memory of the crack in the stone and the cold against her palm, and a voice recorder still sitting on her desk with 3 hours of audio she had not yet been able to listen to all the way through. Kale found her at the cottage. She was not surprised. She was not sure what she was. He stood in the doorway with the easy stillness of someone who had learned, over a very long time, not to fill silence unnecessarily. He told her that the anchoring, the connection between her and his essence, could be severed if she wanted, that there were people who knew how, that it would be painless, that the choice was entirely hers. She looked at him for a moment. "What do you want?" she asked. He was quiet, not because he was unsure, but because the habit of wanting things had taken a long time to come back to him, and he was being careful with it. "I have been waiting 3 centuries to want something again," he said. "I would like to take it slowly." She looked at the bags by the door. She looked at him. She thought about the book and her grandmother, and a crack in a stone on a cold gray morning. and the complete, unreasonable feeling that she had walked into a story that was, somehow, also hers. She left the bags where they were. Outside, the village of Greyvale was quiet. The hill at its edge stood as it had always stood, dark, patient, covered in old moss. The crack in the Vithara stone had healed over on its own, slowly, in the days after the ceiling broke. Not closed. You could still see the line if you looked for it, but no longer broken, just marked. The story that nobody in the village talked about after dark had not ended. It had simply moved somewhere else, into rooms and conversations, and careful, unhurried beginnings, into the space between a woman who had stumbled into history and a man who had been waiting inside it for far too long. Some things are sealed because they are dangerous. Some things are sealed because someone is afraid. And sometimes, by complete accident, a person with no plan and a borrowed book and entirely the wrong kind of courage reaches out in the dark and sets something free that was only ever waiting to breathe again.